The year is 1958. The setting is the grand gilded halls of Stockholm, Sweden. The air is thick with the scent of old money and intellectual prestige. A man stands under the spotlight, a golden medallion heavy in his hand, the applause of the scientific elite washing over him like a tide. This is Joshua Lederberg. At just 33 years old, he is being crowned a titan of modern science, receiving the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine for his discoveries concerning genetic recombination and the organization of the genetic material of bacteria. The narrative etched into the history books that day was simple, clean, and compelling. The story of a lone genius who had single-handedly unlocked the secrets of life itself. The world loves a singular hero, a man who pulls knowledge from the ether through sheer force of intellect. But if you look closer at the photographs from that era, if you peel back the layers of the official story, you start to see the cracks. You start to see the ghost in the laboratory. History tells us that science is a meritocracy, a pure pursuit where the best ideas naturally rise to the top. We are taught that the Nobel Prize is the ultimate arbiter of truth and contribution, but history is also a master of omission. While Joshua Lederberg basked in the flashbulbs of the international press, the person who had actually handed him the keys to the kingdom was standing in the shadows, her contribution reduced to that of a supportive spouse. This wasn't just a partner, this was the architect of the very tools he was being celebrated for. Her name was Esther Lederberg, and without her, the stage in Stockholm would have been empty. The irony is suffocating. The scientific community celebrated Joshua for his work on how bacteria swap genes, a process that fundamentally changed our understanding of genetics and paved the way for everything from antibiotic research to genetic engineering. Yet the practical methodology, the literal physical mechanism that allowed these experiments to be conducted efficiently, was not his invention. It was hers. It was a technique so simple yet so revolutionary that it is still used in every microbiology lab on the planet today. It was called replica plating. And it didn't come from $1 million grant or a prestigious fellowship. It came from the mind of a woman who looked at a piece of velvet fabric and saw a way to copy nature. To understand the magnitude of this theft, we must first understand the lie of the lone genius. The myth suggests that Joshua Lederberg woke up one morning with the answers to the universe. But science is a process of tools and techniques. You cannot paint a masterpiece without a brush, and you cannot map the bacterial genome if you cannot track the bacteria. Joshua had the theory, yes, but he was blind without a way to prove it. He needed a map. Esther gave him that map, and when the world came calling to thank the cartographer, they gave the medal to the man who simply held the paper. This is not just a story about a bad marriage or professional jealousy. This is a cold case investigation into an intellectual crime scene. We are here to dust for fingerprints on a prize that was stolen in plain sight. The erasure of Esther Lederberg was not an accident. It was a systemic feature of an era that believed women belonged in the kitchen, even when they were busy reinventing science in the laboratory.
The Velvet Revolution. To truly grasp the injustice, we have to go back to the bench. We have to look at the work itself, stripped of the awards and the politics. In the early 1950s, the laboratory at the University of Wisconsin was a chaotic hive of activity. But amidst the noise, Esther Lederberg was a force of quiet, devastating precision. She wasn't just helping out, she was pioneering. Before the Nobel controversy even began, Esther had already etched her name into the bedrock of microbiology, though few bothered to read the inscription. She was the one who discovered the lambda-phage, a virus that infects bacteria. This wasn't a minor find. The lambda-phage became a model organism, a fundamental tool that molecular biologists would use for decades to understand how genes turn on and off. If she had done nothing else, this discovery alone should have cemented her legacy, but she was just getting started. The problem facing the lab was one of logistics. They were trying to study mutations in bacteria, specifically how bacteria developed resistance to antibiotics. To do this, they needed to compare colonies of bacteria on different petri dishes, one with antibiotics, one without. The standard method of the time was agonizingly slow and prone to error, using a tiny wire loop to pick up bacteria from one dish and transfer them to another, one by one. It was like trying to copy a book by rewriting it letter by letter. It was inefficient, and it made large-scale experiments impossible. Joshua was stuck. The theory was there, but the physical limitation of the experiment was a wall he couldn't break through. Enter Esther. While the men debated high-level theory, Esther looked for a practical solution. She needed a stamp, something that could pick up an impression of an entire colony and transfer it perfectly to a new surface. Her solution was a stroke of domestic genius applied to high science: velvet. She realized that the tiny, upright fibers of velvet fabric acted like thousands of tiny needles. If she pressed a piece of sterilized velvet onto a petri dish, the fibers would pick up a few cells from every single bacterial colony. She could then stamp that velvet onto a new dish, creating a perfect mirror image replica of the original. It was elegant, it was cheap, and it changed everything. With replica plating, they could suddenly screen thousands of colonies overnight. They could prove that genetic mutations happened spontaneously before exposure to antibiotics, a finding that shattered existing evolutionary theories. This was the engine of the discovery. This was the how behind the what. But here is where the tragedy sets in. In the published papers, her name appeared, yes, but often as a second author or buried in the acknowledgments. In the lab hierarchy, she was listed as an unpaid associate. The university had strict nepotism rules that prevented her from holding a paid faculty position in the same department as her husband, so she worked for free. She worked for the love of the science. She poured her genius into a vessel that bore his name. She was the engine room of the ship, keeping the gears turning and the fires burning, while he stood on the deck, looking through the telescope, telling the world he was sailing the ship alone. The Velvet Revolution was hers, but the flag planted on the new continent was his.
The climax of this silent tragedy arrived with a phone call in late 1958. The Nobel Committee had made their decision. Joshua Lederberg, alongside George Beadle and Edward Tatum, would receive the highest honor in science. The citation specifically mentioned his discoveries concerning genetic recombination. The word his hung in the air like a guillotine blade. It severed Esther from the legacy she had built. When the news broke, the Lederberg household must have been a landscape of complex, suffocating emotions. For Joshua, it was validation, the ultimate triumph. For Esther, it was the moment the door slammed shut. We must scrutinize the acceptance speech. In the annals of Nobel history, there are moments of grace where winners acknowledge the teams behind them. This was not one of those moments. Joshua Lederberg stood on that world stage and accepted the accolades for work that was inextricably linked to Esther's replica plating and her discovery of the F fertility factor. He did not invite her to share the podium. He did not insist that her name be added to the citation. He absorbed the light, casting a shadow so long that Esther would essentially disappear within it for the rest of her career. The Matilda effect, the systematic bias where women's scientific contributions are attributed to their male colleagues, was playing in real time, broadcast to the world. The aftermath was a slow, painful fade. While Joshua catapulted into scientific celebrity, becoming a department head and later the president of Rockefeller University, Esther was left to fight for scraps. At Stanford University, where they moved after the Nobel win, she struggled to get a tenure-track position.
The woman who invented replica plating, the woman who discovered the lambda phage, was forced to accept a role as an adjunct professor, a position with no tenure, little security, and significantly less pay. She was demoted to the rank of a helper in a field she had helped create. Colleagues remember her having to fight for lab space, having to justify her presence in a department that treated her husband like a god. It is only now, decades later, that we are beginning to wipe the dust off the lens. Modern historians and scientists are finally looking at the papers from the 1950s with fresh eyes. They see the name E. Lederberg on the defining texts. They trace the lineage of the lambda phage research back to her bench. They acknowledge that without the velvet of replica plating, the genetic revolution would have stalled. We are rewriting the captions on the old photographs. We are putting the ghost back into the machine. Esther Lederberg died in 2006. She did not die a Nobel laureate. She did not die with the fame she deserved. But the truth is a stubborn thing. It waits in the archives. It hides in the footnotes until someone is willing to read them. Today, we do not just remember her as Joshua's wife. We remember her as a pioneer, a visionary, and a victim of a scientific culture that cared more about gender than genius. Her legacy is not just in the textbooks she should have headlined. It is in every woman in STEM who refuses to be erased. We speak her name to settle the score. Esther Lederberg. She did the work.